The presentation of Toledo stories is made possible in part by Key Bank, celebrating the strength of our region's history and supporting the promise of its future. Key Bank, achieve anything.
Tramp, 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 tighten up the line. Watch the playful horse flies as on the mules they climb. Whoa, back us the mules, forget it, I never shall. For I'm every inch a sailor on the Ohio Canal.
With the opening of the Erie Canal between Lake Erie and the Hudson River, canal fever spread.
Virtually the entire eastern half of the United States is connected up by the mid-1840s with this highway system that was really water, was a canal.
Tramp, tramp, tighten up the line. Watch the playful horse flies as on the mules they climb. Whoa, back cuts the mules, forget it, I never shall. For I'm every inch a sailor on the Ohio Canal. Now I shipped on board at Portsmouth Town with Captain Billy York. The first thing ever he rolled on board's a barrel of Black Rock pork. All the way to Cleveland he fed it to poor old me. Then he boiled the barrel and the rest of the pork, and we had it all for tea. Now just outside of Massillon we struck a lump of coal. It gave the boat a hell of a shock and stove in a big hole.
Transportation. It's the lifeblood of any city. The Anthony Wayne Trail is a main artery into and out of Toledo. This route was a major factor in the early development of the city, but not as we know it today.
This is the old Miami-Erie Canal. It operated from the early 1840s up until about 1910. You could go from Toledo to Defiance, and then from Defiance to Cincinnati on the Miami-Erie Canal. Also at Defiance, at a place called Junction, you could switch and get on the Wabash and Erie Canal and go from there down the Wabash River through Fort Wayne and down to the Ohio River. It took from Toledo to Cincinnati about 5 days and 4 nights to get there. Top speed was about 4 miles an hour, and it cost $9. This is the tow path where mules would tow the heavily loaded canal boats up and down the waterway. A portion of this tow path is preserved by the Metro Park District, and you can walk from Providence Metro Park at Grand Rapids to Waterville and Farnsworth Metro Park and walk along the same path where the mules walked.
After the American Revolution, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and other leaders recognized that if the interior of the country was to be developed, settlers would need a way to get their goods to market. They were confident that canals were the answer.
Well, right prior to the War of 1812, the nation was beginning, of course, to experience this westward movement. Kentucky and Tennessee had joined the Union, and Ohio had become a state in 1803. And during this time period in Ohio's early development, the rivers were the most important highways and routes of transportation. We really had very little as far as land travel was concerned.
In 1817, construction began on New York's Erie Canal, and Ohioans began plans for an elaborate system that would make markets around the world accessible from their extremely fertile farmland. The routes were laid out along the major rivers that had been used for commerce on a smaller scale by Indians and pioneers. Construction began in 1825. 2 years later, short sections of the canals opened to traffic, but it was 9 years before the 309 miles of the Ohio and Erie was completed from Lake Erie at Cleveland to the Ohio River at Portsmouth. That same year, 1834, the Miami and Erie was opened between Dayton and the Ohio River at Cincinnati. It was another 9 years before the Wabash and Erie was opened from Fort Wayne, Indiana, to Lake Erie at Toledo. Construction was essentially completed by 1845, with a number of feeder canals and a section joining the Miami and the Wabash. It was the most expansive system in the country, with over 1,000 miles of navigable water and 451 locks, raising and lowering boats as they moved across the landscape.
So the canals really in Ohio got their great impetus from the Erie Canal of New York State.
And of course, it is the Great Lakes that made New York City what it is. When the Erie Canal was opened, New York City was the third or fourth largest port in the East Coast. And after the Erie Canal opened, New York City became number one and has remained that way.
With the success of the Erie Canal, they refer to this as the fact that many states caught canal fever. And I'm sure you could pretty much say Ohio caught canal fever a little harder than any other state.
Welcome aboard the Monticello 2. I'm the captain of your boat today, and I'm going to give a brief history of the canal for a few minutes here. This is called the Ohio Erie Canal, and this is an actual part of the old canal that's been restored. The canal used to be 309 miles long.
Even today, there are operating boats at 3 locations: the General Harrison at Pequot, the St. Helena II at Canal Fulton, and the Monticello II by Roscoe Village.
I see a lobster. A lobster? I see a lobster. You've seen a starfish and a lobster.
The speed limit was definitely 4 miles an hour. To keep from washing the banks, one of the great problems they had was muskrats digging holes in the banks, and they'd dig a hole through the bank and water would rush out and they'd have a break in the canal, so that they had these work boats all along the canal constantly filling up muskrat holes. They had a boat that was a grass cutter, had a blade attached to the boat and pulled along to cut the grass where the weeds were growing.
It's easy to get carried away with nostalgia on a beautiful sunny afternoon. In the 19th century, the long-distance traveler often had a much different reaction, especially if he was a cultured gentleman from Europe.
Nor was the sight of this canal boat in which we were to spend 3 or 4 days by any means a cheerful one, as it involved some uneasy speculation concerning the disposal of the passengers at night, and opened a wide field of inquiry touching the other domestic arrangements of the establishment, which was sufficiently disconcerting. I found suspended on either side of the cabin 3 long tiers of hanging bookshelves. I descried on each shelf a sort of microscopic sheet and blanket. Then I began dimly to comprehend that the passengers were the library, and that they were to be arranged edgewise on these shelves till morning. And yet, there was much in this mode of traveling which I heartily enjoyed at the time, and look back upon with great pleasure. Even the running up bare-necked at 5 o'clock in the morning from the tainted cabin to the dirty deck, the fast, brisk walk upon the towpath, when every vein and artery seemed to tingle with health, the lazy motion of the boat, when one lay idly on the deck, looking through rather than at the deep blue sky.
Before long, the railroads would be rushing passengers past the pleasures of canal travel. But canal boats could still carry large cargo efficiently, and many remained in operation until the Great Flood of 1913. They were with us long enough to affect a unique and colorful lifestyle.
You can talk of your pleasure trips on the Great Lakes. A trip on a canal boat, you bet, takes the cake. Where the beefsteak is tough as a fighting dog's neck, and the flies they play tag with the cook on the deck.
I should say something about the man that I learned a lot of these songs from. His name was Captain Pearl Nye, and he was born on a canal boat in Chillicothe in 1876, died in Akron in 1957. He sailed on the canal until the canal closed down in 1913, and thereafter went around the country, recorded for the Library of Congress and Ohio State University, and tried to preserve the lore and songs of the canals, and he wrote a number of songs himself.
Tell a little something about your family on the canal. How many of them were you?
Well, there were a large family. There were 18 of us, 11 boys and 7 girls, and I'm the 15th youngster, 9th boy. And we had one great old time, swimming, falling overboard, and as you might expect from a large family. And music and song more or less controlled our home. We all had good times. Oh, days of heaven here on earth I never will forget. Take the world, but give to me the old canal.
And where'er we went, we took along our home, sweet home, you know, in those balmy days along the old canal. My dear friend was 40 feet from bank to bank, you know, 6 to 12 foot lift, you'll find this all along.
Some of the crews were quite rough, and others were very well-established families. Frequently there were children. The captain and his family were quartered in the stern of the boat. Some of them had a cabin in the center, which was a stable, and the crew's quarters forward.
20 more, dear pal, and where'er we went, we took along our home, sweet home, you know, in those balmy days along the old canal.
Now this you call
Mudport Basin.
Mudport Basin, which was just a natural wide spot.
Yeah.
Originally, wasn't it? A swamp.
This is a place where the boats could turn around and stay all night here when it's crowded on the canal.
Did they cut ice here?
Yeah, they had some ice houses. They would sell blocks.
Yeah, that was another function of the canal, was to provide them with ice. That all of these wide spots were served in the winter as ice ponds.
Yeah, they did a lot of ice skating here. They used to have Sunday night bonfire and ice skating parties here. They'd skate all the way to
Oh, what fun we had that night, yes, everyone. The mules did win, all kick and prance, tried so hard to join our dance. I'm up in years, young, and a better life could never come. Let others do what they will, dear pal, I will stay with the old canal. Oh, what fun we had that night, yes, everyone. The mules did win, all kick and prance, tried so hard to join our dance.
What happened when there was when boats were waiting to go through a lock?
That was a different story. Locks were first come, first served, and if you weren't the first one there, you'd have to wait your turn. The problem was, canal boat captains weren't very gentlemanlike, and they kind of wouldn't be courteous at all. They'd say that they were there first, if they were or not.
They even hired special people. There was one guy who came down from New York. His name was the Buffalo Bully. I remember reading about when the boats were just empty and the crews would just fight it out, and the ones that weren't in the canal got on their boat and went on farther on. They just throw them in. Skin them alive, hang their carcass on the fence. Don't stop for naught, no matter what expense. Pound them on the back till they lay over. Catch that boat, I say. She's pretty fast, but faster we can go. Haul them in if they won't lay over, Joe. Get that boat, for the whole crew is with you. Get that boat, I say.
Today, when we drive along the highway, along the river between Florida, Ohio, and Independence State Park, and we look at the canal, it looks just like a sort of a forgotten, muddy ditch of sort. And perhaps one doesn't get too excited over its historical importance, but yet you have to stop and realize there was a tremendous amount of effort which had to be undertaken to construct that canal. It was more than just digging a big ditch in the ground, because in digging the canal, you had to have a rate of descent in that canal so that it would provide a flow of water, so that the locks would function in the canal, because the locks all were gravity flow operated. And of course, this was all done with wheelbarrows and pickaxes and shovels. They didn't have any of the modern type large earth-moving machines that we have today.
Most of the laborers on the canals were people that were hired locally. They'd sort of contract out the job, but then there'd be people that moved along, lots of Irish and German immigrants. There's a song by an Irish immigrant. Part of it goes, "When I came to that wonderful empire, it filled me with greatest surprise, for to see a full 1,000 brave heroes on the like never opened me eyes. We were all marched up in good order, they were fathered now unto us all. Sure, I wished myself from that moment to be working upon the canal."
There are hundreds of graves all along the canals, both marked and unmarked. Workers died from smallpox, typhoid, cholera, but the big killer was malaria, then referred to as the ague, the shakes, and locally as Maumee fever. In the beginning, workers were paid 30 cents a day and 5 jiggers of whiskey. It was thought that the whiskey would help ward off the ague, but as the deaths mounted, they realized it was doing more harm than good. Local temperance societies were formed, and their success led to the area's first labor strikes. Contractors found it increasingly difficult, even as wages rose to $26 a month, to keep workers on the job, especially in the summer months when the death toll was the highest.
Also, the locks, and in places culverts and aqueducts had to be constructed, because whenever the canal would reach a natural stream, you see, they had to bridge that natural stream. And this really makes one have a much deeper respect for these canal workers when you see what this project really entailed, because the stone had to be cut, it had to be hauled tremendous distances with teams of oxen and carts, and so it really was a tremendous undertaking.
This is lock number 9 of the Miami-Erie Canal. These massive stones here were quarried in the Marblehead Peninsula and brought to this site by barge. When they were put in place, they were cut by stonemasons and faced off smooth so that the canal boats coming into the locks wouldn't rub against the walls. The entire lock itself was about 90 feet long and about 16 feet wide. Across the bottom, underneath the earth here, was oak timbers, and the entire stone structure was laid on those timbers. In addition, there were oak plankings that were laid down lengthwise, and that's so when the canal boats would come into the lock and find a low water situation, they'd be scraping against wood instead of stone. The lock gates were set in place here and at a hinge point on either side, and they always opened upstream so that if there were flooding conditions, they would keep the gates closed and keep the lock from being damaged. If we take a look up here, we can see Ludwig Mill, which utilizes water power from the canal system to operate the milling machinery. This mill began in the 1820s and was moved from the site over so that they could build the canal. Isaac Ludwig was the third miller to operate the mill, and he was a canal boat builder, so he was very closely tied to the canal system.
Efficient transportation and water power for industrial growth was worth fighting for.
The coming of the canal definitely sparked rivalries. A good example of this rivalry was upriver at what we know as Grand Rapids, Ohio today.
At that time, the residents of Gilead, which is now Grand Rapids, across the river, had a great fear that they would lose out on commerce and the trade from the canal system. At night, there were problems. The dam was blown up, and the state eventually sent in militiamen, posted sentries at either end of the dam, and finally the wooden dam was constructed.
And finally, to really compromise with the people of Gilead, the state did agree to build a small canal which would bring water from behind the dam through the town of Grand Rapids to provide a flow of water for their mills.
And I suppose it's an irony of history that Providence no longer exists and Grand Rapids is a flourishing community yet today.
The biggest prize of all lay at the end of the canal where cargo would be transferred for lake shipment. Beginning in 1817, speculators plotted 11 towns within the 15 miles from Maumee to Lake Erie. They all had the dream of founding the great port city.
Here, where Swan Creek meets the Maumee River, seemed to have a distinct advantage. There was an unusually deep channel that ran right next to the shore. Summit Street was on a high bluff, so it was an easy matter to grade off the top and fill in the marshland along the riverbank. Now, once Water Street was filled in, a long row of docks would allow boats to tie up right next to large lake steamers, sailing ships, or warehouses. Originally, there were 2 towns here, Vistula and Port Lawrence.
Vistula and Port Lawrence still were not what you'd call great financial successes. Both of these villages failed to attract a great deal of commerce from the lake. The early leaders of these communities were rather downhearted to see many of the vessels from Lake Erie go right on past, heading upriver for Maumee, Perrysburg. Well, the two communities realized that if they were going to survive, they'd better forget their competitive spirit and their rivalry, and they'd better join together. The name Toledo begins to appear as early as 1833.
Toledoans were confident that they were in a position to become the great metropolis of the West. But there was one very serious problem. Ohio's Constitution said that its northern border was on a line from the southern tip of Lake Michigan to the North Cape of Maumee Bay. But the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 clearly stated that the border was on a line due east from the tip of Lake Michigan, which left Maumee in Ohio, but put Toledo in Michigan.
Michigan law was enforced here. Michigan taxes were paid to Monroe County. All property purchases were recorded in Monroe, Michigan, the county seat of Monroe County. And as a result, no one really gave this too much thought until it was announced that the Ohio legislature was going to be extending the Wabash and Erie Canal project from Indiana to the Maumee River. Now, that caused great alarm among these early pioneers here in the Toledo area, because they realized the state of Ohio was certainly not going to construct a canal at their expense and have that canal end in Michigan to benefit a Michigan community.
Ohio is by this time in the late 1830s a state and has representatives in the United States Congress. Michigan is still a territory, and it ended up a battle of a state with representatives in Congress versus a territory without any representation. And in the end, the whole issue was settled by the President of the United States and the United States Congress. That strip was awarded to Ohio, and we have the current boundary that exists today between Ohio and Michigan. As a consolation prize, so to speak, Michigan was awarded the Upper Peninsula.
Canal construction moved forward, and on January 7, 1837, Toledo was proud to incorporate as a city in Ohio. But the speculators needed patience. It would be another 6 years before the first boat arrived from Indiana on the Wabash and Erie, and 9 years before the Miami and Erie was complete all the way to Cincinnati. But it was worth the wait. Toledo's economy boomed, and the surrounding wilderness, as if by magic, transformed into well-manicured farms. Ohio's population grew from 600,000 before the canal to nearly 2 million by 1850. Over 2,000 boats transported goods and passengers throughout the state.
So that before the Civil War, you have a fairly good-sized town with a goodly number of buildings surrounding that downtown section, and a very large high school, for example, which is on the grounds of the current Toledo-Lucas County Public Library downtown, a huge, massive building. It gives you some indication of the kind of population that Toledo had at the time. It really did enjoy a boom as a result of the canal.
The Ohio canals were built a little late. The railroads came almost as soon as the canals. And of course, the railroads had the advantages that they could operate the year round. The canals had to close 3 or 4 months a year.
The Ohio canals, which were state financed and maintained, were never a financial success at all for the state government. But the canals did provide a tremendous opportunity for development and growth within the state of Ohio. Many towns were developed along the routes of these canals. Some of them are nothing more than ghost towns today. And of course, some communities developed into large cities along these canals. And I think in terms of Akron, Dayton, for instance. The Civil War pressed the canals very heavily into use, as of course it did the railroads. And the Civil War, the demands of that war period and transporting men and materials, supplies, really proved the worth of the railroads once and for all over the canal type of travel. And so it was that the canals were sort of on the downgrade as we moved toward the latter 19th century.
Once I made money by driving a fine team, but the goods are now hauled on the railway by steam. May the devil nip the fella who thought out this plan. It'll ruin us poor teamsters and every other man. It spoils our shorelines wherever it passes, and it makes of us poor fools some damn fine asses.
The last actual canal travel in this area would have been in 1913. We had the worst flooding in this 20th century here in much of the Midwest, and stretches of the canals were literally washed right out. And the state of Ohio decided not to go to the expense of repair. And then, little by little, sections of the canal were drained and filled in, graded, and then in the 1930s, one of the New Deal projects in our Toledo area was to create the Anthony Wayne Trail along this right-of-way.
The canals never actually paid for themselves, as promoters had promised, but their contributions to the development of the state made the investment worthwhile. The framework of Ohio's transportation network lies on the ruins of the old canal, and the emphasis they gave to Toledo as an important port city lives on.
Taking the slack, hitch a reef in your shirt tail and straighten your back. Whatever you do, be sure don't forget, tap the mule gently when the cook is on deck. Forget it, I never will try. Those were great days of living, you ne'er cared to die. 'Twas next door to heaven, so carefree and sane, a horse ocean sailor I'll ever remain. Oh, those were fine times and no equal had they. Whatever the weather, we'd run night or day. If I owned the world on the ditch I would run, for no other life has such oceans of fun. So haul in the tow line and take in the slack, hitch a reef in your shirt tail and straighten your back. Whatever you do, be sure don't forget, tap the mule gently when the cook is on deck.
The presentation of Toledo Stories is made possible in part by Key Bank, celebrating the strength of our region's history and supporting the promise of its future. Key Bank, achieve anything.